You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by Nax.
Welcome to Convenience Matters. My name is Jeff Leonard. I'm with Nax, and on Convenience Matters, we talk about things that matter at convenience stores. We get about 160 million consumers a day, so if they matter to us, they probably matter to just about everybody out there.
And I'm John Eichberger with the Fuels Institute and Nax, and we talk about everything that powers you. Powers your body, powers your vehicle, whatever it is you need, you can probably get at a convenience store. And today, Jeff, we're talking to an expert in the retail fuels market, Ron Sabia, former president of Gulf Oil, current board member of Gulf Oil, board member of the Fuels Institute. We're going to chat about market fundamentals and what happens when big storms hit. So, Ron, thank you so much for joining us on Convenience Matters today.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Jeff.
We really appreciate you coming on. We were talking before we came on board about, what's going on. And this year, the forecast that I've seen for hurricane season seems to be pretty non-newsworthy. It's kind of the same situation the last 30 years as this year. And, of course, we all know how accurate weathermen can be, right, Jeff?
Yeah, and you just never know. I do media interviews all the time, and they say, well, right now oil's in the 40s, and nothing seems to really be affecting that right now. And then I always just say, you don't know what you don't know. And it could be global unrest that happens within a couple minutes, or it could be some sort of weather pattern that forms. It could be a variety of things, but always have to be on the watch out.
I remember a few years ago there was an EPA report. And EPA said, the fuels distribution infrastructure works great when nothing goes wrong. And, it's one of those things where you go, okay, that's a wonderful plan of action going forward. But, Ron, early in 2017, you came into Washington and you participated on a briefing the Fuels Institute put on to talk about infrastructure and hurricane preparedness. Can you kind of share a little bit about what that briefing was about and what was talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. We came down to Washington to brief congressional staff on the way the infrastructure system works. I think there's not a great deal of knowledge on the topic up on Capitol Hill, and so it was an opportunity to let folks know how difficult it is to get product to market and how difficult it is to make this big ocean liner turn when we do have a crisis. The system is incredibly flexible, but at times, particularly when severe weather hits, hurricanes in particular, it takes a lot to get the system back in place.
And Jeff, it's critical that we spend time talking to these guys up on Capitol Hill. I was a congressional staffer. I lobbied for 15 years, and it's amazing how many people think electricity comes out of a socket in the wall. And I had one person actually say, man, these gas station guys are brilliant. They know exactly where to put these stations right where the gas reserves are. It's really a fundamental lack of understanding what's going on up there.
Yeah, I had a similar conversation with a reporter, and it was right before one of the hurricanes that hit the Gulf Coast. It was probably Katrina/Rita that year. And the question that was asked of me is, well, if all of these hurricanes hit the Gulf and cause all this problem, why don't we have all the refining somewhere else? Why don't we have all the oil rigs somewhere else? And it was, because that's
same reason
really.
You rob banks. That's where the money is,
Yes.
right? So, Ron, you've been working in the retail and wholesale sector for a long time, and you were at the helm when Sandy hit. From a fundamental infrastructure perspective, kind of walk us through, if you're going to sit down with the congressional staff, didn't know anything about it, what would you want to share with them? First of all, about the system, and then as we start getting ready for potential disruptions with natural events, what types of stuff do you want them to know?
Well, I think they need to know regionally where the fuel is and where it travels to. I think most of the refining, and as we talked about, and the entry to all the major pipelines is in the Gulf Coast. So we tend to worry about fuels infrastructure in the Gulf Coast first, because if we lose our refineries, if we lose the ability to ship product from the Gulf Coast up into the Northeast and the Midwest, we would have some very difficult issues that it's tough to recover from. But weather issues are not only on the Gulf Coast. When Sandy struck on October 29th, we had a much different system because very little of the oil infrastructure is located in the Northeast. As a matter of fact, only about 7% of the refining capacity in the U.S. is based in the area affected by Sandy, and it only supplied about 40% of the gasoline to the affected area was out of those local refineries. The balance was shipped in from the Gulf Coast or from the Midwest, and also imported. And so, to some degree, even though the infrastructure was not hurt terribly for refining, it was a downstream problems that really made it difficult.
And can you
for instance. I'm sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
I think you were just picking up where I was just going to ask. Can you take us through some of those things, whether it's down power lines or power outages, how they affected the downstream operations?
Absolutely. About 8 million customers were without power in the Northeast, and many of them the wholesale terminals that supplied fuel, and hundreds of gas stations. In addition, you had a lot of flooding. You had thousands of roads closed with debris, trees, and the like. And even the maritime passages in the harbor were not passable. They had to make sure that there was not debris in the shipping channels, and that kept us from getting imported product or product moved via barge into the area. But to me, the key issues were power at terminals, and at retail stations in particular. There were 28 terminals I know affected by flooding and power outages, and several of those terminals were shut down for months, as it turns out.
So what a lot of people don't get, Ron, is, you have a disruption like that, a storm, whatever, and there may be fuel at the stations, but if you can't pump it out of the ground, it really doesn't do any good, does it?
No, absolutely not. If you can't pump it out of the terminals to get it to those stores, it's also not very valuable to you. So it really became an issue of getting power back, and whether that was folks doing generators at the terminals and at the stations, whether it was clearing those roads so trucks could pass. And being able to get those vessels into the harbor to help bring product in. The other thing that was very helpful was a collaboration between state, local, and federal officials to provide some flexibility on some of the activities and rules that normally were in place. So, for instance, fuel quality specifications were waived, so we could bring conventional gasoline to the market from areas like Maine and western Pennsylvania to assist in getting product to the market.
Just a shameless plug, that authority to waive those fuel specifications, 2005 Energy Policy Act, a provision advocated by NACS. So you're welcome, world. I was being interviewed on a TV show, news Squawk Box, I think it was, years ago. I think it was right after Sandy. And I was asked, you guys knew the storm was coming. Why didn't you supply more product? And I looked at him and said, you do realize that there is a limited capacity of storage under each station. Well, you should have topped them off. And I said, but the other point is, and I got one of their guest hosts blasted me for this because he just didn't understand what I was talking about. I said, we had some stations reporting a 400% increase in demand the days leading up to Hurricane Sandy, because people said, oh my goodness, I may not be able to get fuel, and they left their traditional refueling patterns. And we're in such a just-in-time delivery system that if you change demand structure by 1% to 2%, one way or the other, you really kind of mess up the entire redistribution system. Isn't that right, Ron?
Absolutely. I think people don't realize how much of how difficult it is to keep the product flowing and do it seamlessly. I mean, during Sandy, 4 days after the storm, still 2/3 of the station did not have fuel. Either they couldn't pump it or they didn't have it in tank. And a couple of days after that, almost a week in, still there was about a quarter of the stations that didn't have fuel. And so what you would see is, in many cases, customers following the trucks to the station. They saw a gasoline truck headed down the road, and they would follow them to the station because they knew they would have gas wherever they dropped the product. And it even got so difficult at times that consumers were so concerned about their fuel that there were altercations. The drivers couldn't even drop the fuel safely. So we had to rely on law enforcement to help us drop fuel at times.
Now, having grown up and lived in the greater New York City area, I'm stunned to hear there were fist fights. Just stunned. So,
I know, my home city as well.
So Ron, when you did the congressional briefing, was there anything that you came back with and said, wow, that was really a good message. They understand this. Were there any surprises along those lines that you really knew you were making a difference in communicating our message?
No, I got a lot of positive comments afterwards that there was a general lack of expertise they acknowledged, and that they were very happy that we came by to inform them a bit. I was also impressed with the youth of the congressional staff, and how much energy they had.
Impressed with the youth. See, that's a very nice way of saying, wow, they are young. I mean, when I was up there, I was on the older side of congressional staff, and I was 28. It is a environment that is absolutely in desperate need of insight from the communities that they're representing, because they're being asked to consider legislation or regulations and policies that they don't have any independent knowledge about. And unless they can rely on people from back home to explain to them how the market works, they're really kind of throwing darts in the dark.
Right. And we laid out many of the things that happened during Sandy, whether it was going back to odd and even fueling days, which is the way I learned to drive. My father would let me have the car if I'd stand in the gas line for him, that hadn't happened in 30 or 40 years. As well as waiving fuel specs, they waived the Jones Act, so you could use non-U.S. flagged vessels to come in, driver hours for truckers. The trailer weight limitations for trucks going across states. And we were even able to, believe it or not, put some trailers on the bottom level of a ferry going from Connecticut to Long Island, since the problems in Long Island were so big. So they really did a lot of things to really assist, along with obviously the industry's efforts, which were always superhuman in these kind of situations, to get us back up and going.
Jeff, Ron just kind of outlined some of the things that industry and government did together. And one of the questions we had from the audience at the briefing was, what can we do? Okay, we can't add more storage. We might be able to position generators at different locations, but if you don't have fuel, the generators aren't going to do a whole lot for you. The industry has done some pretty good work in terms of providing emergency electricity supply to transfer points on the pipeline to keep the pipeline moving. They've done really good at shoring up refining infrastructure to make it more defensible and anticipating outages and shutting it down in time so they can recover faster. But I think the critical thing is there's only so much you can do physically. It's that collaboration between industry and government that really delivers results. After Katrina and Rita, the waiver of fuel specifications reduced the price spike by magnitudes. If we had not waived diesel sulfur specs for on-road diesel fuel, if we had not waived RVP controls for volatility of gasoline, chances are prices would have gone much higher, shortages would have been much more rampant, and the economic impact of that storm would have been so much more extensive. We always complain about government. That's the time, and these are situations when industry and government come together and they can actually make a difference.
And it really is about communication as well, because if you have that fuel truck and it's being followed by customers looking for fuel.
Like the ice cream man.
Yeah. And what do you get? 6,000, 7,000 tops gallons in a drop? That's going to last you about 6 or 7 hours.
Right. Especially if you increase demand by 20, 30% or even 400%. I mean, that stuff goes fast.
And so it is about communications, and it is about telling your story, because the logical presumption is, well, they've run out of gas, they planned this, and it's all a big conspiracy. So when everyone can talk from the same page and be as transparent as possible, we get to a much better outcome in terms of how consumers feel and how the system remedies itself quicker.
So I think it's fun. So Ron, let me ask you a question about something Jeff just mentioned he's heard. Have you ever made money when you didn't have product to sell?
Nope, not once.
It's ridiculous. They think this stuff.
I wish I could, but I can't. I haven't figured that one out.
It's the other thing is, we're talking about disruptions, but this system if you think about the complexity of it, we have got 700 miles of pipeline, something like 70,000 miles of product pipelines. We've got 1,500 or more terminals. We've got 150,000 retail stations. We have 270 million light-duty vehicles out there in the market. And every day, people can pull up to a station, they can refuel. And they may be in a environmentally controlled district, it might be in a non-environmentally controlled district in terms of fuel supply and fuel composition. We're blending ethanol that doesn't go in the pipelines, has to be blended at the rack, and has to be mixed before it gets. So many things, so many factors. The Colonial Pipeline has more than 100 products going through it. And yet, every single day, we're able to deliver product to consumers. 50 million transactions a day on fuel? That is an unbelievable accomplishment that we just take for granted outside of our industry.
And how efficiently it's done. It's a relatively inexpensive process to be able to get all that done. And think about the hundreds and millions and billions of infrastructure investments folks have had to make that happen.
Yeah, to be able to do that, to buy enough energy to drive 300 miles on like $40, that is remarkable. Try getting a ticket on mass transit to go 400 miles for under $40. It's not going to happen. And we are still, the United States, still offering probably the lowest price gasoline in most of the advanced economic markets. And that is a feat. Our country spans 3,000 miles. And we are able to move product from point A to point B in a way that most people just can't even comprehend and still deliver that value at the retail. And they still have money left over to go inside the store to buy sandwiches, fresh fruit, coffee, and water. It's a wonderful, wonderful industry to be part of.
Yeah, and even during Sandy, they became kind of the general outposts because there was fuel there was water there, there was folks were even letting people charge their phones and things at the stores. Made it kind of the gathering place to get the most information about what was happening during the fuel crisis on Sandy.
So, Ron, if there's one thing that you can leave retailers with in terms of what they can think about, so in case there is another hurricane, superstorm Sandy, or something like that affects us, what can they do to think about their business, and what can they think about in how do they tell their story or talk to consumers? So what can they do now, and what might they want to think about if something, whether it's a superstorm, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's some other disruption, how do they tell that story?
Well, I think to me it always starts out with people don't really understand that your local fuel supplier on the corner is not making the entire price of the retail fuel. That their margin stream is relatively small, somewhere between 10 and 15% of the cost of the fuel. And that when prices are high or rising, when people tend to be most unhappy, is when their margins are worst. And so it's always difficult to be on the front lines with consumers. So there's a misconception. I think a constant discussion with your consumers about the business is always helpful. I think for helping your business going forward, if you can afford a place to hook up a generator, that's a nice to have. I know that so many of the stations out there are single site operators and may not be able to afford that, but it at least gives you an opportunity to hook in a generator should that opportunity arise. I think aligning yourself with good suppliers and loyal suppliers is a way to go. It's obviously the branded customers and the contractual unbranded customers were the ones that were served first after first responders, and trying to make sure that if you have limited product that you're taking care of your contractual customers first. And so sometimes those folks that bought on the spot, were having to scramble a bit more at the end.
And, Jeff, I'd also offer that helping develop an understanding of the fundamental operations of the system is important. Fuels Institute issued a report a couple months ago, at the end of 2016, focused on infrastructure. People should go to fuelsinstitute.org/research, pull down the infrastructure piece. It's written for non-industry experts. It's really written for Congress. It's written for administration, government officials. So it really provides a one-on-one on how product gets from point A to point B.
Well, thank you, Ron. And take a look at some of those resources that we have. And thank you for listening to Convenience Matters.
You've been listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. For more information, go to nacsonline.com.